About 6 years ago, while lying awake in bed in the middle of the night, something happened that convinced me I was dying. I don't get scared too easily, but this was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. And standing at the top of my stairs was a tall shadow figure, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned top hat. At the time, I'd never even heard of sleep paralysis. I'd never heard of the Hatman. Hell, I'd never even heard those two things mentioned in the same sentence before. I thought whatever happened to me that night was my monster. Some weird hallucination. Some stress-induced psychological breakdown. Something personal to me. Then my wife showed me something on her phone the next morning that made my stomach drop. Apparently, thousands of people around the world had seen the exact same thing. And recently, it happened again. Now, to those who know me, one thing you can probably agree on is that I'm a pretty skeptical and cynical guy. Probably to my own detriment sometimes. So the fact that I'm sitting here telling you a story involving a shadow figure in a top hat that came after me, yeah, let's just say the irony's not lost on me. Believe me, I wanted a rational explanation for what happened. In fact, the paralysis itself terrified me far more than the ghost or shadow figure. But before we get to any of that, I need to take you back to 2020, peak COVID lockdown. To set the scene, I don't recall the exact date, only that it was late spring or early summer, and we were in the height of COVID lockdown insanity. I remember this because my dog Toby was still alive, and he passed shortly after. My daughter was only 3 years old. I also remember it was on a Sunday night because I had work the next morning. At this point, I had already been working from home for months, and I'd slipped into a routine where I was staying up too late every night after my wife and daughter went to bed, usually sitting downstairs watching TV, doom scrolling on my phone, and psychologically preparing myself for whichever new COVID variant the media told us was about to wipe out humanity next. I would do that until I would fall asleep or catch myself falling asleep on the couch, at which point I'd drag my ass up to bed. On this particular night, I had finally decided to call it quits around midnight and head upstairs to bed. So I shut off the TV and began my usual dad check routine of making sure the doors and windows were locked, and started making my way through the downstairs. Now, before I continue, I need to briefly explain the layout of the house because it actually matters for this story. I don't live in some creepy 100-year-old Victorian mansion in the middle of a forest. No, we live in a pretty standard suburban 2-story house built in 2006. Not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to be haunted, unless ghosts apparently enjoy builder-grade appliances and HOA violations. One important detail though, the stairs in my house creak, especially the bottom few steps. I don't know why, just that they always have ever since we moved in 10 years ago. My wife is an insanely light sleeper and often complains that she can hear me coming up the stairs every night no matter how quietly I try to sneak into bed. Another important detail pertaining to my bedroom is that from our bed, we have a direct line of sight to the bedroom door and the top of the stairs that the door is open. And at night we kept the door open in case we had to hear our daughter, who was 3 years old at the time. Her bedroom sits just across the hallway from ours. So anyway, on this night I'm downstairs near the front entryway finishing my nightly lock check routine when I suddenly hear what sounds exactly like footsteps on the stairs at the other end of the house. Immediately I think, oh great, the wife's awake. The sound was unmistakable. It was the exact creaking noise those stairs always make. So I turn and walk toward the hallway expecting to see her standing there. But nobody's there. I recall even having had this brief moment of confusion and kind of a what the fuck was that thought. But whatever, I had just confirmed the house is secure, so I'm tired and I'm going to bed now. I headed upstairs, hearing the familiar creak of the steps under my feet, the exact same sound I had just heard moments earlier. Once I reached the top, I stopped briefly to peek in on my daughter, who was sound asleep in her room, surrounded by enough nightlights to safely land aircraft in there. Then I made my way into my bedroom where my wife was already asleep in bed. Again, she's an insanely light sleeper, so usually no matter how quietly I try to tiptoe into the room, she wakes up, usually just enough to ask if I locked the doors downstairs. I tell her yes, she grumbles something incoherent back at me and immediately falls back asleep. Same routine as always, nothing felt weird, nothing felt wrong, and that's important, because at this point I still had absolutely no idea something was about to happen that would scare the living shit out of me. I get situated in bed and close my eyes. Good night, Moon. Or so I thought. As I laid there, I don't really remember what I was thinking about, but I do remember realizing pretty quickly that I wasn't falling asleep. Not even close. My brain was still running at full throttle. And after a while I started getting irritated because I knew if I didn't fall asleep soon, tomorrow was absolutely going to suck. I had to be up around 6:15 for work, and at this point I could already feel myself heading toward one of those nights where you just lay there getting progressively more annoyed at your own existence. Eventually I picked up my phone to check the time, 1:05 a.m. And for whatever reason, that time is permanently burned into my memory. Maybe because seeing it genuinely pissed me off. Because in my mind I had just laid down, but somehow an entire hour had already passed and I didn't feel remotely close to sleep. I was wide awake. As I laid there growing irritated, unable to focus on much other than the precious sleep I was losing with every passing second, I started mentally retracing everything I'd consumed that day, trying to figure out where I screwed up. Did I have caffeine too late? What time was my last Diet Coke? Was that 2 p.m. coffee somehow still haunting me? Anyway, I was probably only a few minutes removed from checking the time when I heard it. The first unexplainable noise downstairs. And it immediately caught my attention because it wasn't one of the normal house noises I'd grown used to tuning out over the years. It wasn't pipes creaking, it wasn't wood settling. No, this sounded like a small object rolling across the hardwood floors downstairs, like a toy or a marble. The sound only lasted a couple seconds, but I remember immediately freezing and listening for anything else that might help me understand what I just heard. Keep in mind, we had a 3-year-old at the time, so the idea that there could be some random toy lying on the hardwood floor downstairs wasn't strange at all. The strange part was, who kicked it? Because the only other adult in the house was lying right next to me, sound asleep. And if I'm being completely honest, even that irritated me. I remember laying there looking at my wife peacefully sleeping beside me and feeling weirdly jealous that she was asleep and I wasn't. Which sounds insane now, but in that moment I was just in this awful negative headspace. Everything irritated me. Every sound, every thought. It almost felt like this cloud of negative energy had parked itself in the room and engulfed me. I could literally feel my body tensing up in bed. Every thought that passed through my head evoked an angst in me. I was angry about COVID. Angry my daughter was growing up trapped inside during all that insanity. Angry that her daycare had shut down and she couldn't see her little friends anymore. I was angry we'd had to cancel our summer vacation and normal life and everything else. And on top of all that, my mother was extremely sick at the time with lung disease, living with my adult sister who I constantly worried wasn't taking COVID seriously enough. In that moment, I was angry at the world. And angry I couldn't fucking sleep. So I continued laying there, simmering in this cloud of anxiety and negativity while listening to the silence in the house. And honestly, for a few minutes those thoughts distracted me from the weird noise I'd just heard downstairs. Until I heard the next one. This time it sounded like it came from the kitchen, like a cabinet door slowly creaking open. And I remember immediately feeling annoyed because now I knew I was probably going to have to get out of bed and investigate it, which also meant probably waking up my wife in the process. But at this point there had already been multiple unexplained noises downstairs, and whether I liked it or not, duty called. I quietly slid out of bed, doing everything I could not to move the mattress and wake my wife. I remember reaching for the baseball bat I kept beside the bed and debating whether I actually wanted to take it down with me, because I thought if my wife saw me carrying it, she'd immediately get spun up too. And honestly, I still wasn't fully convinced something was wrong. I'd already checked all the doors and windows downstairs. The house was locked up. The idea that someone had broken in just didn't feel plausible. I also have security cameras on both sides of my house. I would have gotten a ring alert if anyone approached an entry point. And then I suddenly had another thought. A completely rational one. The dog! Toby! At the time, we still had our old Yorkie Terrier Toby, who was definitely on his last lap of life by then. In his younger days, he used to follow us room to room around the house and bark at literally anything that moved outside. But by this point, he was old. Really old. Half blind, mostly deaf, and perfectly content spending almost all day curled up in his dog bed downstairs in the family room. So while it seemed unlikely, I figured maybe Toby'd gotten up and wandered around in the dark and bumped into a toy or something on the floor. And honestly, that explanation felt a hell of a lot better than the alternative. So, baseball bat in hand, I quietly started making my way downstairs as stealthily as CHONnely possible. As I reached the bottom few steps and the stairs inevitably creaked beneath my feet, I recall envisioning my wife upstairs probably opening one annoyed eye at that exact moment. I also decided right then that once I cleared the downstairs, I was leaving the bat down here so she wouldn't see me carrying it back upstairs and immediately assume we were about to be murdered. Once I got downstairs, it was almost completely dark. And I know this sounds strange, but for whatever reason the house felt darker than normal that night, aside from the faint glow of the microwave clock. I'd walked through that downstairs in the dark countless times before, and any other time I'd probably tell you I could navigate it blindfolded. But this time I almost felt completely handicapped by the darkness, like the darkness itself felt heavier somehow. I immediately regretted not bringing my phone down with me for a flashlight. This blinding darkness meant I had no choice. I reached over and flipped on the lights. Boom! The recessed lights kicked on and the whole downstairs lit up like a supernova. And just like that, every shadow disappeared. No intruder, no open doors, no cabinet doors hanging open, no overturned furniture, nothing. Everything looked exactly the same as when I'd left it earlier that night. There wasn't even a toy I could see on the floor to explain the sound I'd heard. Then I looked across the room and saw Toby laying in his dog bed. The sudden light had startled him awake and he was peeking over the side of his bed like a confused little teddy bear, with his cloudy old cataract eyes trying to figure out who was standing there. And honestly, the second I saw him I felt relieved. Confused, sure, but mostly relieved. I walked over, knelt down beside him, and started gently petting his head. "It's okay, buddy. It's just me." And this next part is hard to explain without sounding completely insane. It's actually a little embarrassing, but sitting there in the middle of the night petting my dog, I suddenly got overwhelmed with this intense feeling of sadness and dread. Remember, Toby was old, really old, nearly 15, and I'd had him pretty much my entire adult life, years before I met my wife even. And in that moment, I remember looking at him and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he wasn't going to be with us much longer. So there I was, at 1-something in the morning, crouched on my living room floor, hugging my little half-blind Yorkie while tears started rolling down my face for absolutely no reason. Which was not normal for me. I wasn't somebody who randomly sat around pre-mourning my still-living dog in the middle of the night. But in that moment, I just felt this overwhelming emotional heaviness that I couldn't explain. So I slid the baseball bat underneath a nearby chair out of sight, scooped Toby up in my arms, and decided he was coming upstairs to bed with me. I made my way back upstairs and crawled back into bed, situating Toby between my wife and I. Of course, she woke up. She asked if everything was okay. I assured her that it was, and moments later she disappeared into the bathroom, apparently not even realizing the dog was suddenly in bed with us. While she was gone, I grabbed my phone and checked the time again. I didn't memorize the exact minute that time, but I remember it was definitely after 2 a.m. because seeing it immediately pissed me off all over again. I was now looking at 4 hours of sleep at best, assuming I could even fall asleep. My wife climbed back into bed, muttered,
"Love you, good night,"
and was asleep again within minutes. I, meanwhile, remained aggressively conscious. If anything, going downstairs had somehow made me more awake. And before long, I started hearing noises downstairs again. Little knocks, taps, random sounds scattered throughout the house every few minutes. At this point, they weren't even scaring me anymore. I'd already checked the house twice and knew nobody was down there. so these just had to be normal house noises, right? Eventually I checked the time, 3:11 a.m. I remember that because for some stupid reason I specifically remember making the connection to the band 311 from when I was younger. Chill. Which somehow only irritated me more, because now all I could think about was how absolutely miserable tomorrow was going to be. I worked for a hospital at the time, and Mondays were always chaotic, especially during COVID. There was no escaping it either because nobody was leaving the house back then. The chaos lived with you. My wife and daughter would both be home all day while I tried to work, and I remember laying there thinking, why couldn't this insomnia night have literally been any other day of the week? I started kicking the idea around in my head of maybe calling in sick just so I could sleep. But then I immediately pictured my wife glaring at me while juggling her own work and a 3-year-old all day while I slept upstairs like a princess. Then I caught myself becoming irrationally annoyed at my poor wife over a completely fictional argument happening entirely in my own head. Again, I was just trapped in this spiraling cloud of negativity while the noises downstairs continued to taunt me. I knew I just needed to distract my brain somehow, so I threw in my AirPods and put on a podcast. Nothing interesting to keep me engaged. Just enough background noise to drown out my own thoughts, so maybe I could squeeze out a couple hours of sleep before my alarm went off and I was forced to survive what already felt destined to become one of the worst work days of my life. For a little while it actually seemed like it was working. The podcast distracted me just enough that I stopped obsessively listening for every little unexplained sound downstairs. I even remember having this brief moment of relief where I thought, okay, this is finally working. And no sooner than that thought entered my head, my wife suddenly sprang out of bed and stormed out of the room. What now? I thought. I pulled one earbud out and I listened. At first I assumed maybe our daughter was awake and she was going to check on her. But no, I heard her clomping straight down the stairs. Moments later I saw the glow of the downstairs lights kick on beneath the bedroom doorway. I remember laying there debating whether I needed to get up again too when a minute later I heard her coming back upstairs. Then I heard her feeling around the bed until she found Toby. I heard her kiss him. Finally, I asked, "Everything okay?" And without hesitation, she replied,
"Yeah, I thought I heard something downstairs."
Bruh. I played it cool, but the second she said that, I felt this immediate knot in my stomach. Because now it wasn't just me hearing things anymore. I checked my phone again. 4:25 a.m. I remember just staring at the screen thinking, are you fucking kidding me? At this point, I wasn't even sure I wanted to fall asleep anymore. Somehow that almost felt scarier. I started mentally calculating dangerous amounts of caffeine I could consume to survive the next day when suddenly, a sharp sound from downstairs. Then another one from somewhere else in the house moments later. I glanced over at my wife hoping for some kind of reaction, but of course she was already back asleep. Meanwhile, I was growing more irritated than afraid now. The noises sounded deliberate, haunting. Every 30 seconds, maybe a minute, another sound somewhere downstairs. And then I heard the one sound that made every hair on my body stand up. The stairs. That unmistakable sound only those stairs made. I immediately opened my eyes and lifted my head toward the bedroom doorway. Then I heard it again. Another step. Slowly, one by one, something was coming up the stairs. And I remember thinking, no, because only the bottom few stairs creaked. After that, you could walk quietly if you stepped carefully. So I counted the creaks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then silence. I just sat there staring into the darkness, waiting for whoever or whatever had come upstairs to appear. And then it did. The hallway was dark, but I could see this shape slowly rising into view near the top of the stairs. tall. Like freakishly tall. I'd probably put it at 7 feet or taller. Very thin, wearing what looked like some kind of old top hat of sorts. Like an old bowler hat with a wide brim. I couldn't make out any actual facial features, no eyes, no mouth, nothing. It looked like a big shadow, except the room was already dark, and somehow this thing looked even darker than the darkness around it. When it reached the top of the stairs, it just stood there, staring at me. And even though I couldn't see its eyes, I could feel it was looking right at me. I instantly thought of my baseball bat and immediately regretted knowing I left it downstairs. I still wasn't sure what it was that I was looking at, but whatever this was, I knew I had left my best means of self-defense downstairs, and I was now vulnerable. At that moment, my first thought wasn't even about me. It was of my daughter. I remember immediately trying to game plan in my head what I was going to do if this thing moved toward her room. If it came into my room, I figured maybe I'd pretend to stay still and try to ambush it somehow. But if it turned toward my daughter's room, I was charging that thing out of bed full speed. And weirdly, although part of me was terrified, I also remember feeling angry. Like whoever or whatever this thing was, how dare it come into my house uninvited and think it was going to harm my wife or child. And as it just stood there, taunting me at the top of the steps, I found myself growing almost impatient. Although I could feel my heart racing, time slowed down in that way it does when you're hit with a sudden rush of adrenaline. I literally recall game planning in my head how I would fight this thing. Because it was tall and standing next to the staircase, I envisioned charging its legs and flipping it over the banister. Which sounds completely insane now, but in that moment, I wasn't trying to understand what I was looking at. And the longer it just stood there, the more impatient I became. 30 seconds. Maybe longer. Long enough that my neck actually started stiffening from holding my head up staring at it. And I honestly don't even know if I said this out loud or only in my head, but I remember thinking, well, come on, motherfucker. If you're gonna do something, do it. And I swear to God, the instant I thought that, it charged straight at me. What had been standing 20 feet away suddenly flew toward me at what felt like impossible speed. I remember my head slamming back into the pillow as this thing engulfed me in darkness. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. I tried to move my arms. Nothing. My legs wouldn't move either. I remember trying desperately to yell my wife's name. Mabel. But I couldn't make a sound. And that was the moment the real terror hit me. Because I realized I was completely paralyzed. I had absolutely no control over my body. Honestly, I thought I was dying. That was the only explanation my brain could come up with in that moment. I literally had the thought, did I get shot? Was I stabbed? Is this the death process? I felt like I was slipping away into this darkness while my body just lay there trapped beneath me. I have no idea how long it lasted in real time. Maybe a minute? Maybe longer. But eventually, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The blackout lifted. The room was still dark, but just regular dark. The blackness was gone. Whatever that shadowy figure thing was, it had disappeared. I could see the ceiling again. I realized I could move my head. Then my arms. Then my legs. I sat straight up in bed doing inventory on my body like I just returned from the dead. Everything worked. And in that moment, I just remember this overwhelming flood of relief. I looked at my wife sleeping. I thought about how much I loved her and how thankful I was to still be here with her. How terrifying that I almost just died right beside her and she had no idea. I love my daughter so much and I was so happy I'm still alive and get to be her daddy. I started feeling this sense of euphoric relief and happiness. But I swear, mere seconds later that relief turned into panic again with another terrifying realization. Like, what if it's not over? What if whatever it was, comes back? But it didn't. Eventually, somehow I actually fell asleep. Or maybe passed out is the better term. I honestly have no idea how long I was asleep for because by that point I'd stopped checking the clock altogether. But eventually I remember waking back up again to the faint glow of early morning light beaming through the bathroom window. It was around 5:45 a.m. The summer sun rises early here in the Pacific Northwest, so the room wasn't pitch black anymore. And honestly, my first emotion wasn't fear. It was relief. Relief that I was still alive. Relief that I could move. Relief that whatever had happened seemed to finally be over. And then almost immediately, Mabel suddenly sprang out of bed and into the bathroom, shutting the door behind her and leaving me alone in the dim light again. A minute or two later, she came back out and immediately headed downstairs. I remember just laying there staring at the ceiling and thinking, what the hell just happened to me? At that point, I still wasn't even fully convinced what I'd experienced had been real. My brain was desperately trying to rationalize it. Stress? Anxiety? Exhaustion? Maybe I'd fallen asleep without realizing it. Maybe it was some kind of vivid dream. I wanted it to be one of those explanations. But deep down, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real. Too real. What felt like only a few minutes later, my 6:15 alarm was going off. Weirdly, I wasn't even mad at it. Honestly, I just felt grateful to still be alive. I scooped Toby up from the foot of the bed and carried him downstairs with me, where Mabel was already drinking coffee while the morning news quietly played in the background. Everything felt strangely peaceful again. And for a little while, I didn't want to ruin that feeling by talking about what had happened. But by late morning, after work had settled down a little, I finally decided to look into it. For context, I have some prior health issues, and my brain had become completely fixated on trying to medically explain what happened to me the night before. Honestly, the paralysis terrified me far more than the shadow figure itself. So naturally, my dumbass immediately started Googling stroke symptoms. I don't think I was even 2 minutes into my research when Mabel suddenly walked into my office, saw my computer, and asked,
"Why are you looking up stroke symptoms? What happened?"
And at that point, I finally unloaded everything onto her. The noises, the insomnia, the weird negativity hanging over me all night, the figure on the stairs, the paralysis, all of it. Now, my wife and I are very different when it comes to this kind of stuff. I'm the lifelong skeptic. She's much more open to supernatural explanations. So while I was obsessing over the paralysis and trying to medically explain it, she immediately became fixated on the shadow figure I described seeing. A few minutes later, she suddenly came charging back into my office holding her phone in my face.
"Is this what you saw?"
And bro, the second she held up the phone, my stomach dropped. Because staring back at me was almost exactly what I saw standing on the top of my stairs. A tall, dark shadow figure wearing a top hat. It even had a name. The Hatman. And I swear to you on everything I love, before that moment I had never heard those words before in my entire life. I'd never even heard of Hatman. I had never heard of sleep paralysis that I can recall. None of it. But suddenly we were finding Reddit posts, forums, YouTube videos, even a documentary movie. Thousands of people all around the entire world describing almost the exact same thing I'd experienced the night before. The shadow figure, the hat, the paralysis, the overwhelming fear. And that was the moment the whole thing truly started to fuck with me. Because up until then I thought whatever I experienced was my monster. Some weird hallucination, some stress-induced psychological breakdown, something personal to me. But now suddenly there were thousands of strangers around the world describing the exact same thing. And honestly, that realization, that may have scared me more than the encounter itself.